Therefore, I'm giving the floor to Sергій Верланов. Probably know him because he used to be the head. For more than 1 year, he was a head of the State Tax Service of Ukraine, and before that, he had been Deputy Minister of Finance. Basically, he knows very well how policies in taxation are shaped, and I hope that we will be able to provide the answers to the most painful issues and the greatest number of bottlenecks which worry the representatives of the industry. Sergey, hello, can you hear? Can you see us well? Greetings. Yes, I can hear and see you well. Wonderful. Then the first question I would like to begin with is it is expected that the new legal and taxation story will be launched on January 1st, 2022. So in fact, we only have 1.5 months before that. Do you think it's enough for a business or for the business environment to make an investment decision to go to a new Silicon Valley? Understandably, there's very little time left. All of us, we know about the rule of 6 months, which holds true for tax innovations, and this draft law work is still going on. The work is still in progress, and not too many plenary sessions are available, and yet the law on the state budget hasn't been voted in effect. Therefore, ahead of us is still a lot to do, given the timeline, the 45 days. Because the majority in the parliament are consolidated, I still stick to the opinion that this draft law will be supported. Concerning the transition, business has been preparing, surely. Before I began to work for the public service, I had spent a lot of time in international consultancy services. I know how decisions are taken in the business environment. Businesses usually do get ready, but because this draft law has still not been voted in effect, still hasn't been signed, therefore, within this short term, at such short notice, it will not be very comfortable for businesses to operate. But this is just in relation to this issue. Thank you. Another provocative question. Today we have asked several speakers this question. Do you believe that the guarantee of 25 years for the validity of this regime, both in legal terms and in terms of the timelines, will definitely stand a long time? Or do we have to prepare for arbitration?
Well, it's a multidimensional question. And my approach to this regime would be as if to an experiment. There's too many factors in play. And I would even say that this experiment is the result of a compromise. Because a couple of years ago, when the idea of the Dія City was born, it was far more radical. And there was not a compromise that we have it right now in between of the MDT and the industry. So that level of compromise did not exist. So this experiment, it exists. Can it stay active for 25 years? Well, I'd say logically it's, well, not really. But the simplified taxation system already exists in Ukraine for 20 years. It transforms, but except for certain, changes in 2014 and 2014, it never went any worse. It has become, in fact, more loyal to the entrepreneurs. The second example of the experiment was the alternative sources of energy. It has their own risks, but still, the law has been slightly amended, but no radical changes. And My vision on the future development of the project, I'd say that it has a number of great risks. First, it's still an experimental project. And secondly, it's fairly discriminative by its nature with regards to other professions, because it's not about the simplified taxation system. It's about the last taxation rate for income tax to certain individuals. And this idea with regards to concept, it has changed a bit. The tax amnesty was amended. There are different rates for passive and active incomes, but the salary rate was left fairly unchanged. So the only positive thing about the state budget not seeing the incomes from the single tax as they're being sent to the local budgets. So therefore there's not going to be a direct loss on the part of the general fund of the state budget, but still it poses a risk. And can result in certain amendments to the law or certain decisions by the Constitutional Court or other courts, but this risk is not new to Ukraine. People live with that. So should you be asking me whether this law will stay the same in 25 years, then I'd say no, there will be changes to this law. But whether this experiment has a great chance of success and remaining solid and to live its own life, as it is for sole proprietors, yes, I think it has a chance. There is a substance. There is an industry. It's not the industrial parks that you need to construct from the scratch. It's not the mythical points of development. You can name them all. You can take quotes from an interview of a former vice prime minister who was dismissed recently. So it's not the ideas, it's a sustainable idea, because this idea is based on the industry, which is generating a significant portion of the Ukrainian GDP. A lot of people are employed by this industry, so a decision is having a lot to do with a lot of people. And it's going to be very difficult to change something in that matter. Well, according to the last and most valid calculations for the share in GDP and any foreign currency transactions into Ukraine, over the 3 quarters of this year, over 4.8 billion of USD were transferred to Ukraine as coming from this sector. So still, it's a fairly solid data. We all understand that the model or some sort of all-round support to sole proprietor, it worked. It was legal. It is legal, and the state was not receiving too much out of that. That's an interesting question. It's all about the risks of requalifying the relationship with the sole proprietors. But should we refer to the past and the future projects? How do you think? It's more going to be of a political guarantee, but still, the old periods, they will remain politically untouched. But what will happen to those who will take a decision and not become a resident of the Dія City, and who will stay and watch its developments? Is there any tools within the state tax service or the state employment service to properly substantiate the legal positions on legal qualification, particularly in the post-COVID time, when there is no co-working, when You're not able to go and question anyone. Yes. The situation has changed, and the topicality has been reduced a bit. Speaking about the tools available within the state authorities, let's look at the facts. As we've mentioned during the previous panels, there is no established court proceedings. There's certain gaps with regards to legal position. I mean, the tax services, they have certain provisions with regards to how to do the inspection. A couple of years ago, there was an attempt to produce mass certificates of inspection like that. The industry has become more solid, more developed, and it's not dependent on Ukraine from the point of resources. So it's not related to any soil or any fossil fuels or any minerals or anything like that. So there's not so much tools to have an impact on the industry, and it can come up with an argument that we will all leave the country and nothing else. So it's a difficult story. And therefore, I do believe that the risk with regards to the previous periods will not aggravate. Speaking of those who would wish to remain, really that would be the outliers, because if there is 100 and 30 of them, or 70 of them have already joined and 30 have not joined something, now imagine what will happen to those 30, to those 70. So it's all about this evidence-based approach. So these are the odd one outs. Why haven't they done this? That is why the risk of detection, it will increase. Speaking of the legal position, I would draw your attention to the recent research of the Center of Economic Strategy on the on the misuse of those paying a single tax. That was a research that was published just a week or a couple of weeks ago. Now, speaking of those who commit this misuse, it's all about the sole proprietors of the second and the third group. It's working in the field of retail or food supplies. The IT or legal services, they are rendered without any significant cases of misuse. And to the left, you can see a scale that, like 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's the level of misuse. So the restaurants and retail at second or third category, they would be having 4th to 5th rank, but the IT services, legal services, consulting services, now that would something that would rank to like 1.5 to 2. Whether the IT experts are the main violators? No, they have the substance. They have. Every hryvnia they receive would be properly taxed, and one of the criteria of reaching the upper limit and switching to another category of sole property is something that we almost never see. Speaking of the substance, the legal position would be the same, but for the courts and for public authorities within the Dія City, they will be having a large argument in terms of challenging this status quo. So definitely the risks will remain. There will be more material, more real, and the level of detection will increase, evidently. Well, starting from the 1st of January, the industry and we, the lawyers, the experts, and the whole country, they will be born in a new IT reality. And can you tell us, today's framework law and the draft law on taxation says that only the MDT can verify the compliance of the criteria for residentship. And then there could be a post-audit, meaning the audit report. And should we expect the attempts of the taxation authorities to question the compliance of the company to different categories? Because that's a significant legal or tax benefit. So maybe the taxation authorities would try to question those tax benefits. Look, I want to share with you a story and share an experience that I have with regards to what is the state governance and what is the delimitation of powers on authorities. Now, so that's something to the left and something to the right. Now, to the right would be the capabilities of certain state authorities to fulfill the functions. And we took this path in Ukraine starting from the mid of 2000s. We're talking about the differentiation of the public authorities into central executive authorities and the ministries. So the ministries would be establishing the policy, while the executive authorities would be the one to implement this policy and to control that. Now, those functions, they could be, they're classical sort of functions. That's a living system. There are power games, there are certain operational solutions, tactical solutions, strategic solutions in play, but still the expertise with regards to inspections, speaking on the MDT or any other ministries, there is no such expertise because they've got different objectives to fulfill. And speaking on the self-renewed threat, that exists as well, meaning the agency that came up with the policy and then starts to verify the compliance with that policy. Now, in this case, that ministry is becoming engaged and is unable to make an inadequate decisions because this ministry is going to be biased or that agency is going to be biased. And that's the challenge that could arise. That's why any ideas, whenever the agency that creates the policy becomes the regulatory or supervisory body, now that's a very risky approach. During the previous session, the representative of the industry, I think Konstantin, he was absolutely right to mention that we believe that SRO, or we're not willing to have SRO, but still, if there is leaders, then the SRO would be okay. Look, that's a mistake. The state is not going to work in that manner. The public institution, people, the employees, and the public institutions, they tend to change by the seasons of the year, depending on the political situation. We are okay about building a wooden house in summer, because it's summer, for God's sake, and we're not going to be there in winter. I believe that the concept when the ministry is going to be the one to do the inspection, I'd say that these could be happening only during the first stage, if any at all, and not to be creating a separate central executive authority for that. So that's going to be the first stage. At first, the Dia came up with this idea. Then part of them turned into the supervisory body, or the body that is implementing state policy in the sphere of this industry. And then, having institutionally completed all these developments, having institutionally created the agencies, this agency will become separate, and or its supervisory regulatory functions will be delegated. So the ministry will remain the licensing agency. It will have 22 or 23 employees, and according to the timetable of the Ministry of Defense, while the supervisory function will be delegated to the state authorities entrusted with the service. It's either the state taxation service or the state labor service. Now that's my vision, and since this is the natural development, for any public agency, I think this is something that you might expect. Thank you, Sergey. You can't... Well, let me put it in simple words. We cannot say that this function at certain stage of political development could be transferred to the state taxation service. Okay, Sergey, I have another question. I think that's going to be the last one and the most practical one. It's evident that those not having any presence in Ukraine, for them the establishment of a new company and shifting its focus to the Dія City, that is creating the presence in Ukraine, would result in many legal questions and many other questions. And Ukraine indeed has implemented a lot of actions on developing the taxation database. But still, as an example, I'm having a good startup with my friends. We've came up with the new Hyperloop. And so we've decided to establish the Cyprus, like Malta, company, C Corp, for example. So we have some sort of a company we're supplying reports, but our 30 to 50 sole proprietors are still working here. So in the frames of this Dія City and the legislation that is about to be approved, just wanted to remind that the taxation service would have new levers and new tools that they can use, particularly with regards to identifying the permanent place of residence for a non-resident that is concluding contracts, or declaring certain foreign company Ukrainian ones. That is why all the revenues that I got from Malta, they will become subject to the taxation efforts in Ukraine. And we also have rumors that the Ministry of Finance and the State Migration and State Taxation Service, they're already thinking how to use these new tools. So your vision on the future scenarios is every R&D center, any structure that we have in Ukraine, particularly if it's being under control of the foreign element, would that structure be under risk?
There is always a risk. Risk is always there. First of all, some 10 years ago, in our tax code, this article appeared, this norm about constant representative officer that has to be based in Ukraine. It kept transforming, lots of translations were added, amending. Then a large law followed, which spoke about BEPS steps, and now the steps of further implementation. It isn't so simple and easy. When my team was in the State Tax Service, naturally we had our own R&D center, where we would work with GULESA and MIF with their technical missions from the standpoint of how these things should be done properly, because the ideas were like, we have so much on our table, so standing representative offices is something unrealistic. Everything was pretty simple and easy. The recipe that we came up with was accessible, but this simplicity has stopped serving its purpose, unfortunately, so new approaches have to be employed. Because just as you have rightly mentioned, nowadays, in your office, people will not be sitting there from 9 to 5. They will be working according to contracts. They will probably never be seen in your office, where there will be only 5 employees working on a constant basis. That is to say, there are multiple options available. So this risk holds valid for all businesses, and year in and out, it will get more and more tangible. But sooner or later, the State Tax Service of the Ministry of Finance will get to the point of tackling this issue. Although the work on these representative offices is more to do with ideology, because a standing representative office should be operational by the bodies that deals and engages in investments. This is from my personal standpoint, and therefore the State Tax Service should not replace this agency or body whose function is to assess the possibilities of the would-be investment and the maturity of these organizations. There is a concept when a mature business cannot and should not hold its standing representative offices. In some countries, in the Czech Republic and some other ones, there are certain terms specified when these representative offices should be there, standing, non-standing, and how this transformation takes place. So this BEPS issue, I think, once again, I am under the impression, and I'm bringing my run to a close, the situation is crystallizing. First of all, the exchange on CRS will become the first break point. And this is when the state bodies and the country, the government itself, will have enough material and content to say that tax residents of Ukraine are beneficiary owners of bank accounts for such and such institutions, at such and such institutions, and accordingly, having this thesis and verifying the validity of this thesis from different institutions, once again checking whether this person is a resident or a non-resident, or whether this person is out of the Ukrainian taxation, and whether they are on a special registration at consular offices abroad, then that will provide us with some serious additional arguments and facts to radically and drastically change our approach concerning the standing representative offices. Otherwise, we will stick very much to today's practice of inspections when you don't have a certain entity within your country, and that cannot be verified. Once again, law enforcement agencies are to deal with that, but tax inspection is not up to it. They are not authorized to do that, these bodies. Okay, thank you very much. Before I give the floor to the audience members, still I would like to ask you a very brief question. Your recommendations to the first residents of Dija City from taxation point of view. The recommendations or tips are all about getting all of the necessary documentation, explanations, necessary rulings, taxation consultations and advice, to get all of the generalizing explanations from the Ministry of Finance. So basically, you will have to force these agencies to work in compliance with their promises, because promises get forgotten very quickly, just overnight. And all of the people that you can deal with, at a later point, suddenly, they say that they cannot affect the decisions anymore. Political cycles are also changeable. We cannot predict or foresee what will happen in the future 100%. But what is being promised currently is to be recorded and fixed in additional records. So these are letters, taxation, explanations of general character, specific character, just as I have said. From my capacities, which I have at my disposal, and from my perspective, today's leadership at the Ministry of Digital Transformation is ready to stand up for this idea. They're champions of light, and they're shedding the green light to the businesses, so you definitely need to take advantage of that in order to enhance your legal position as well as your status with the respective consequences for the periods that have passed and the ones that are still upcoming, at the point when you mean to enter this specialized system of regulation and taxation, which is called Dія City. Thank you, Sergey. So in summary, obtain notices, taxation consultations, and just enjoy being a resident of Dія City. You will definitely never be sad. It's never going to be gloomy for you. It will be profitable. That's another side to it. All of you in this hall are very well aware of that, but these rates that you're going to enjoy are exclusive. These are like tax breaks, some of the most breakthrough, we would say, rates available worldwide for such a business model. Let's put it this way. We have a question in the audience. Good afternoon, Sергій. My question is, you have been presented as the ex-head of the taxation service of Ukraine. So imagine that you are still the head of the taxation service, and we have a constitutional decision rendered by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine that Dія City is non-constitutional, and paying wages based on the 18% rate. For example, they didn't pay 18%, but was 5%. Just as you said, all of the political obligations lost their validity. New teams have come to power, and maybe the Constitutional Court believes that this law is no longer valid, and the fiscal service will also support that. So how realistic will it be that tomorrow the taxation service will go to these 70 or 80,000 citizens of Ukraine on Dія City, because they're not getting all of the services that you have mentioned, and then it will result in a collapse, and in a single moment the IT system of Ukraine will be destroyed. But because let me remind you, when we had a constitutional crisis in spring, until the site of the Constitutional Court excluded that and eliminated that, they still had the question on their agenda concerning the guarantee fund of Ukrainian investors. So this is like sitting on a barrel of powder. Things get changed, as you said, very quickly, drastically, and overnight. Thank you for your question. There's one subtlety here. So far, the decisions rendered by the Constitutional Court can also be rendered unconstitutional, not from the moment that the law is passed into action, but from the point that decision is rendered. And there is also a separate discussion concerning how this could be, because the Dія City, on the one hand, is good, but on the other hand, from the standpoint of social payments, it's something that does not protect human rights, but it is the way it is. Laws are recognized unconstitutional at the point the decision has been proclaimed, and of course such risks are valid, and such risks will hold true for whatever kinds of laws. But these periods, from my understanding of the legal system of Ukraine and the legislation that holds true for Ukraine, the periods that will be regulated by the law on Dія City until it has been passed into effect, until such a decision of the Constitutional Court has been taken, they will not be well reasoned, because until now the Constitutional Court has already developed its own position about NABU, for example. They have developed an approach at the Constitutional Court that at the same time they recognize it constitutional, and they give dispositions to different executive authorities to resolve this issue in a legal way. So if this law is recognized as unconstitutional and unholy, or maybe some clauses of it, and what law as a follow-up the Parliament will approve into effect, no one can know that for sure. Such examples of taxation, when we do it in a backward way, when rules are changed and amended, especially if we talk about direct norms of application, I cannot recall anything of the kind. Therefore, basically, we can understand that until the law is still in effect, these periods are well secured and protected. And Plan B, if we see that if people are against Dія City law, then we all have to pack up our stuff and go down to the center of the city and picket against it. Another question, there is a part of IT industry which works with distributed teams without registering their companies in Ukraine, without registering their legal presence. And part of these businesses, let's put it this way, is it with private entrepreneurs? With entrepreneurs, but the private entrepreneurs get their money directly from their contractors from abroad. So parts of these companies can have the signs of constant representation in Ukraine, others not, especially now that we have COVID situation, and a lot of such IT companies work with freelancers. So my question is, if we anticipate that there will be, that the tax pressure will be enhanced, especially put on those and exerted on those who don't go on Dія City, these instruments for detection, perhaps if 120 private entrepreneurs will get orders from the same contractors, how many such instruments and how effective are such instruments of detection with the tax service of Ukraine? That's one question. And the second question, if there is such a company working with private entrepreneurs directly abroad, and they decide, okay, let us register a company here because a lot is done here in Ukraine. They come on Dія City and they say, well, hello, here's how much you have still to pay for the 3 years of your previous existence. How high are such risks? Well, both the first and the second risks you have mentioned, from the standpoint of the tax inspection, it's an executive body, and they act in a manner provided by law. Once again, this is an old discussion, and it's characteristic not only of Ukraine. It's typical of other world countries likewise. And I will just share with you about different mechanisms which the tax service uses in this regard. The government, the state, is sovereign, as well as other states that enjoy their own sovereignty. Ukraine as a country cannot tax residents or oblige residents, foreign legal entities, or tax, or rather force such non-residents to register their representation in Ukraine in line with current legislation. Therefore, these risks that you have mentioned, both the former and the latter ones, are still there, theoretically speaking. We can continue theorizing and coming up with some more scenarios, but still, if some officials come up with an act of this kind and they win their case in court, it will be very difficult for the detectives from the state prosecution office to argue against that, because everything is going to be very plain and simple, because at our conference we are sitting and making theories, but that foreign company that paid funds to Ukrainian private entrepreneurs, was it registered in Ukraine? Was it an entity of taxation law? No, it wasn't. Therefore, how can we put taxation on it? Because taxation is only incumbent on residents, and residents have to have their representative offices within the country. The second part of your question is more interesting. Yet the law has no retroactive force unless you are an entity of the Ukrainian legislation. And if you are a non-resident, once again, you cannot be taxed. This is my understanding from your spontaneous question. This is my spontaneous impromptu answer, but this is what it seems to me. How this is done in the world? Well, in the world they adopt laws. In our country, partially. This was also done through the perspective of the tax imposed on Google. This is not a tax on the source, but on the recipient of funds. So this is the tax on Google the other way around, like in France. They have it in place. If a company in France obtains funds from offshores, it pays an income tax from non-residents in the territory of France. That is to say, you obtain 100, that's what you get, and you pay, respectively, on top of that, some more money. At the entry point, taxation is placed on this money. And the same goes for some other countries. So this tax in reverse happens. The recipient becomes the taxpayer. They write what kind of sources they have. Source A, it's an offshore. Source B, it's additional jurisdictions. Source C, non-payers, etc. And after obtaining funds from these entities, you become a taxed object in relation to these non-residents. And of course, your taxation obligations grow. These are complicated ideas which are once again discussed separately. And I have taken part in the city of Paris twice or three times on these points, including digital economy and tax on Google and global digital tax likewise. So all of these global tax issues are processed respectively. These are autonomous also notions when the country itself comes up with a way how it will proceed along with these issues. But the world would also like to develop these global concepts, but that G20 still is doing this work, and the minimum obligation is 15% of the corporate tax. This is the part of this work in progress. So we still observe that the development of these tax relations is going through with the help of classical tax tools. So they didn't come up with any digital taxes, but they decided to come up with a minimum requirement, minimum obligation, and something. If you are, for instance, registered in Ireland, you cannot pay less than 1% of taxes, because the rate needs to be at least 15% without any implicit commissions, deductions, etc.